to actually catch. So thanks for coming to our session here. Just a quick show of hands before we get started. Who has any familiarity with Curious City? If you could just raise your hand. Okay. Oh, good. All right, cool.
Have you sent us a question?
Oh, just one.
Just
all
one.
right.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, good. Some of this will hopefully be new for you, even if you're familiar with it. And then it'll be all new to all of y'all who have not heard of what we're up to. So just by way of some quick background here, I came up with the project 2 years ago. We've been experimenting with it right now for just about that same amount of time. And myself personally, I got into journalism kind of sideways or accidentally. It was not an intended career choice. I've been a journalist for 7 or 8 years now. But as a result, because I didn't go to J school and didn't have these kind of that ethos hammered into me, I questioned the very act of journalism a lot. And I wondered, why did journalists get to determine the coverage that the public got? And I wondered if the public could actually come up with better questions than journalists maybe could. And what might happen if journalists were allowed to, just like journalists have that power to ask questions of people in power or to go places that they wouldn't otherwise be allowed to go. So in some ways, Curious City is an answer to testing these experiments out over the last few years. Not that we have answers to everything, but today we're going to go through a few of the things we feel pretty confident we can say for sure after having run this experiment for a few years and continuing to run it. So just to give you a sense of who we are out of WBEZ Chicago, which is a public radio station. You might know us for small programs like This American Life or Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. That was a joke, but they're huge. I hope you've heard them. And also PRI, NPR, APM, we carry all that content as well. But what we do with Curious City is that we do things locally. That is a mandate. We are producing stuff for our local audience. That means Chicago, Southeast Wisconsin, Northwest Indiana. Those are the places that we personally cover. And to introduce you to the team here, so hello, in case you can't see the name tag, I'm Jen Brandel. I founded and am the senior producer for the project.
My name is Sean Ali. I'm the editor of the project.
And I'm Logan Jaffe. I'm the multimedia producer.
So just to give you a quick sense of the flavor of what we do, we made kind of a trailer video for folks who are interested. And after that, we're going to get into some of the specifics. And we're going to have a lot of time at the end for questions. So please feel free to note stuff along the way. We're going to do some examples and get specific, but there's a lot that we can talk about. And this is just a kind of an overview. So if you could hit play over there, that'd be great. Thank you. Curious City is powered by open questions that anyone can ask about Chicago, the region, or its people. And that's led us to thousands of story ideas we never would have thought to do. No matter how the questions are collected, out in the field, via our 1-800 number, or online, they all end up in our question archive. We curate these questions into voting rounds, allowing the public to vote on each other's ideas. This means our audience decides which stories we take on. Reporting happens from the ground up. Observations and curiosities from the community become our stories.
Why is it called?
How many?
Why aren't they?
Who decides what the
I was wondering.
The winning question is investigated by a WBEZ reporter and by the person who asked it. We show our work as we go, so anyone can weigh in on what we're doing and finding. And often, the public ends up collectively helping us find what we're looking for.
Hi, my name is Melissa McNeil. I am calling to report a parrot sighting.
Anywhere between like 63rd and 35th.
And my kids used to call Nichols Park the Parrot Park.
WBEZ reporters, producers, and hosts have answered hundreds of publicly submitted questions. We find the best way to tell these stories. Sometimes it's radio.
This is a different kind of format.
Sometimes it's articles. Sometimes it's video. And we experiment with other formats like tap essays, comics, interactives, even songs.
Only in Chicago.
The process of reporting our stories creates deep and meaningful connections with our listeners, readers, and viewers. The WBEZ audience goes from being an abstract concept to being Mike and Gerard, Leanne, and Andrea. And WBEZ reporters go from being part of the media to Odette and Alex, Natalie and Anthony. Real people with beating hearts, names, and personalities. The stories that result from this new approach Help illuminate our city, our region we call home. Help our history come alive. Help us navigate what it means to live here now. See you. See you are curious. We're all in it together. It's your curiosity, and it's our curious city.
So again, that's kind of the gist of what we do. It's the kind of capsule version. And what we want to address with people that have shown up at ONA are some of the, as Jennifer had mentioned, some of the lessons we've learned in doing this work for the last couple of years. So one, we'll be talking about lessons we've drawn from directly serving an individual. That is a kind of a surrogate for the rest of the audience. As the trailer kind of shows you, we don't just crowdsource a lot of the reporting or anything like that. We actually we crowdsource the agenda in general. We take on only questions about Chicago, the region, and its people, but we actually draw a single person out from that crowd and engage them. And we'll have some lessons we've learned about that. Another set of lessons, we'll be talking about transparency and how that can enrich and strengthen our reporting. As mentioned earlier, we actually will let our audiences understand what we're working on at any given time so that we can include them in the process in several different ways, and we'll have lessons about that. Also, we'll be talking about how doing some of this work intersects with our multimedia aspirations and how we approach that in a multimedia context. So I'm going to start with some of the participation points. Excuse me, there we go. And this diagram right here just walks you through kind of the traditional editorial process. If you're in newspapers or even broadcasts, you're probably going to be familiar with this. Someone's going to pitch a story that's going to be an editor or a producer or a reporter. And it goes to the next step, that someone says yes or no. That's the assignment process itself. Things get into motion. We start reporting or producing that. Usually people scuttle off and go on their own for a while to dig up the information. Then we publish that. And now, at this point, this is the first point in the traditional process of where the public gets in. And notice I marked it in red here, because in the Curious City process, we're actually experimenting with public participation at every level in the editorial process. As the trailer showed and as Jennifer's explained, at core, at the very least, the entire pitch process for Curious City is based on questions from individuals from the public. We don't do any work that's not related to that. We also experiment with letting our audience assign us stories. Sometimes we'll put questions into a voting round, and we will make a public declaration that we can actually do any one of, say, these 3 stories, and whichever one the public votes up the most, that's the one that we will publicly commit to do and finish. We also bring along our question askers in the reporting process. On the left here, you'll see a woman at the aldermanic offices of her own alderman. Below, another woman who's on the top of City Hall checking out a green roof there. We also show our work along the way. As I mentioned, we use various social media platforms and other means of letting our audience understand what we're doing. Sometimes we'll use Tumblr. We may actually just go on air, and since we're a public radio station, that's pretty effective as well. And we produce lots of different kinds of media, everything from videos to articles to radio stories and a podcast. So I'm going to go over some of the things we've learned from serving one particular person and really satisfying that one person's curiosity. First thing we've learned is that you can actually get a pretty deep story from a very basic question from one individual. As editors and reporters, sometimes I think we take it for granted that the public really understands everything about the news cycle. But honestly, in a city the size of Chicago, at any given time, there's someone who's just exiting the public school system. If you think about that for a moment, that just means that it's going to be their first encounter with a topic, even if they've lived here for a long time. They're completely outside the news cycle, and yet they may need basic civic information. And so this particular question is an example of that. It goes something like this. What do those red X signs mean on buildings? And if you're familiar with Chicago, if you drive around before you leave Chicago, you're going to see some of these little signs affixed to vacant buildings around the city. There's no other signage associated with them. It's kind of a mystery of what they are unless you're really familiar. And here are a couple examples you can see here. One is obviously in disrepair, another one's a multi-story building, and this lower one, if you were to look from the outside, you wouldn't actually know. Maybe you'd want to live there, right? Well, it turns out, Poppy Coleman on the left here, she wanted to know this because there was one in her neighborhood. But again, since there's no signage, what does it mean? It turns out that this is a message to fire department staff that the building is structurally unsound, and it's so unsafe that they may actually consider to let it burn rather than risk lives to save it. But since there's no signage or anything, the entire community is unclear about what it means. Sometimes homeless people will enter these buildings unaware. And this is our reporter, Chris Bentley, tracking down the story in some interviews with Poppy Coleman, our question asker. And our lesson here is that sometimes the questions we get are so basic, but so useful. As we started this story, this is a quotation, the Chicago Fire Department told us, this question is too basic, what else you got? And they're looking for something that's coming kind of out of the news cycle or maybe built from a press release, that sort of thing. They literally said, I don't think we're gonna have time to help you. This turned out to be, 1, a very informative story, 2, one of our most popular, and 3, oh, by the way, it's not that interesting. This program that is meant to save lives of firefighters has actually run out of money, and they did not tell anyone. So Poppy Coleman's question led to City Hall actually considering whether they should refund this important program. Here's another example.
I can take over this part. So oftentimes, going back to serving one person, that one person being the question asker and the person who asked this question, when they're involved, they really begin to shape a story and the actual structure of that story. So one example of this is a question asked by a guy named Dan Monahan. And as you'll see, he asked, how often are taxis pulled over, and what is the most common issued offense that they receive? So a little bit about Dan first. Okay, this isn't Dan, but he is a bicyclist in the city of Chicago. And I guess like any bicyclist in any urban area, you're gonna have some bad experiences with cars. You're gonna have some sort of run-in. And in Dan's case, he has had a couple bad experiences with cabs in particular. So it's funny because you go back to his question, what are the most common issued citations and what are they? He actually had an idea of what that might be based on his own experiences. So Dan was under the impression that that must be reckless driving because he's had so many experiences with them. And he also had this other preconceived notion of the persona of cab drivers. He had this idea, he even says this before we go out and before we actually meet him, I feel like cab drivers are out to get me and I don't know if I should be out to get them too. So we're trying to find a way to bring Dan into the story. So what are we gonna do? What adventure are we gonna go on in order to include Dan in this experience? So what we do is we go out down to the loop and we go cab hopping one afternoon. So the reporter for this story, her name is Odette Youssef, and she's done a lot of previous reporting on the cab industry in Chicago. And we invite Dan to come, and I'm the videographer for this, and we go around with a couple of different cab drivers, and Dan is having a great time, and he's talking with them. And you really, you start learning and hearing and Dan is talking with the cab drivers and getting a different kind of experience just because we had him along. And because of the fact that we did have him along, it opens a whole new range of possibilities for the way that the story is actually constructed. So, out of this, we get a web video product just from this outing with the cab driver. And Odette gets her tape for the story, and it pops up all along the web piece. So as we're going along, Dan is learning and changing and kind of getting his assumption challenged. So by the end of this experience out in cab hopping around Chicago, he realizes, we actually learned that the most common citation was parking, based from talking to all these different cab drivers and from Odette's research, and that changed his mind about the way that he perceives cab drivers in the city. And basically about he actually says his whole perception of the city changes a little bit.
So as we said, we're going to be honest with some of our own lessons and assumptions here. Logan just gave you an example where our engagement with a particular person that started through our own custom-built Curious City application and social media led to editorially a very interesting thing happening. That is the average person on the street becoming a character in your story. We don't have to, as an editor and producer and reporter, we don't have to look for the hook. There's a hook there, and that was a great way to write it through. But I'm going to talk about a danger with that, and individuals can become the people we work with, their experience with us can actually become a little complicated if you're trying to replicate this idea. So I won't read this entire thing. This is a question that was submitted by a woman on the southwest side of the city. I think the key word here is silly putty. That is, she smelled silly putty in her neighborhood quite often, and her question basically surrounded, hey, is this dangerous? How do these things get investigated? What's going on here? We loved this question because we imagined going around town with her and getting to the bottom of this weird ass smell in her neighborhood. And you know what? That's exactly what we did. We went to the southwest side of the city with her and with her children and everything. But I'm warning you that this enthusiasm for the engagement, although there's a lot of editorial value there, I think we went a little too far because we weren't able to find the silly putty smell in a verifiable way. And we did a great explainer about how City Hall does investigate these things in a very official way. But, I made a bad editorial decision in profiling our adventure with her, frankly, it kind of fell flat for the rest of the audience, I think. And so the lesson here is that you can actually get very good explainer information, but maybe the engagement part isn't always so scintillating.
And there are a lot of lessons that we've learned from working with non-journalists. So working with people who do have this kind of beginner's mind and who are approaching the news in a way that, especially a lot of hardened reporters or reporters who have had a beat for a long time might assume they already know the answers to something. But by having a member of the public along, you can actually check your assumptions and get some new information and new dynamics with the people who might also be very press savvy and used to kind of playing the little, silent game that reporters and sources or, press people often play. So one of the great things that happens is when a question asker comes along is that more and different questions are asked in the process. So right here on our left is our political reporter, Alex Keefe. On the right is this alderman, Alderman Burnett. And the question that this woman, Andrea Lee, asked was, what are aldermen responsible for? Now, in a traditional setting and in a lot of Q&A formats that have, happened for time immemorial, what would happen is that we would just answer that question, we would spit it out, and then that would be that. And Alex Keefe would be the only person to really deliver that information and to interrogate the question. But because we have the question asker along, this is Andrea Lee on our left, she can act as a surrogate for the audience in real time when Al is reporting with her. So she is able to say, I don't understand this part of the process. Can you explain it more? Or, I really want to go into this closed meeting right now and learn a little bit more what they're talking about. So she can give us feedback like our audience would, but in real time while the reporting is taking place. And this isn't live. We produce it and edit it later. But she's able to give us a different perspective as it's happening. And then she's also able to get access to someone in power and question them, which I think is a very exciting thing. She actually even said to the alderman after listening to him all day long, she thought the aldermanic system was totally fakaked. And after talking to him, she's like, why are you trying to be everything to everyone? You can't do this. This is impossible. This is an incredible task. And that was powerful to be able to give her the opportunity to really investigate along with our reporter and have an opinion. And then that opinion then gets folded into our story and makes for great tape a lot of the time. So another part of this working with individuals is that they get to appreciate the craft of journalism. You know, everyone probably thinks who isn't a journalist that, oh, it looks easy, you know, there's stuff all over the place, it can't be that hard, all you need to do is write, you got a smartphone, yeah, whatever, we can all be journalists. We know that's not true. We know it takes craft, we know it takes skills, we know it takes a lot of editorial and ethical judgment. And by having people come along with us, they're able to not only appreciate the opportunity of coming along, but they're also able to understand how difficult reporting can be and how time-consuming it can be. And even if it's just them who realize this and maybe share it with a friend, a family member, a spouse, we're educating the public a little bit more, giving them a little bit of media literacy around how our jobs are done and how tough it can be. The other kind of accidental or byproduct of this process is that you get advocates along the way. So, you know, we have voting rounds where people are able to vote on questions that they most want answered. They tell all of their Twitter friends, they tell their Facebook friends, they email their communities and say, vote for my question, I really want to go along with the reporter and get the answer. So our audience is naturally getting outside of the kind of echo chamber that we feel that every institution typically has, and we're able to reach more people. And when we're reporting our stories, they tell everyone, on high. It's different than just saying, oh, this quiz speaks to me because I used to work at Burger King and it's 10 things every Burger King employee used to, has to grapple with or whatever. This is like, they are actually involved in the story. They are the reason the story is produced. So they are extra excited to tell their friends, and their friends are extra excited to see them in this news context, and not just on Facebook, but being, spit out to a broader public. The next point we want to talk about is just transparency. So we can think of that in a few ways. On one level, it's showing the public what we're doing as we're doing it. And one of the ways we do this is we use the byproducts of reporting, the stuff that would end up on the cutting room floor, and we post that. We say, this might not end up in the final story, but here's this great piece of information we found, or here's a really neat map that won't end up in our story, but you should check it out anyway. And we'll post that, on public media, on our site, and all manner of places. But in showing our work along the way, we also create these new opportunities for feedback and participation. We got this great question about this old insane asylum in Chicago. There's a Potter's Field, and there were 30,000 plus bodies buried there. This is something that was news to a lot of us, even in the newsroom. Longtime Chicagoans were like, what? Where is that? How could that be? We just hadn't heard of it before.
Or rather, it had been reported, but 18 years before.
Yeah, so
of course, so.
Yeah. So an editor might say, oh, we did that story 18 years ago. Like, how many of our audiences remember that, and or wouldn't it be nice to do it again and maybe with a new look? So what we did is we used this tool, in this instance, this Timeline.js tool, and we showed people what we were reporting as we were reporting. So our reporter, Robert Loerzel, would cast updates here. He'd say, hey, I'm interviewing a psychologist and a historian. Here are some cool things that I found. And sometimes he'll tweet, I'm going to talk to this person. Do you have any additional questions for them while I'm out? And because he did this, and because we got to this point where people knew that we were reporting the story before it was even finished, that meant that someone could find us that we didn't even know we were looking for. So we posted this. A comment that we got was from this woman who runs a Facebook group about this place that's more than 100 years old, trying to get recognition for the 30,000 people buried there. I don't think we would have thought, I bet there's a Facebook group for this old insane asylum.
Or frankly, if Robert had been doing his reporting, he may have encountered her, but he may have encountered her far too late to have made a difference for the rest of the audience. And she caught us, she reached out to us to stop us and let us understand that there were community members who've been thinking about this issue very directly for a very long period of time.
Yeah, so
it really mattered.
It was very efficient. She came to us while we were mid-reporting, and she ended up becoming a source in a video that we did, and ended up really becoming the reason that we did the video, because she made it relevant for us now, because someone was still caring about this. We might not have found her had we not just alerted people that we were doing this story to begin with.
Okay, but it doesn't always work out that way. So there are some sticky points here when you are opening up the process and letting people know what you're doing all the time. So this question is a good example of a good learning moment for us. So this question, are there any privately owned donut shops in Chicago? Which is the best? It's a good example because there are two things to really note here, right? So if you'll see the highlighted part, what is the best? That's a qualifier. So we need somebody to be the person to decide that this donut shop is going to be the best one. And the other thing to note here is that it's asked by an anonymous person. So, given our process, we like to have people come along and be really transparent about who these people are, but, sometimes we get anonymous questions and we answer them with or without that person if we feel like there's a really, if we feel there's value there. So ideally, in the Curious City world, we would have this anonymous question asker come, go to all these donut shops with us, and be able to help us decide, or even decide what the best donut shop is. So we needed a source to help us decide, and we, in typical Curious City fashion, decided to ask our favorite people, the public. So you will see in this map here, all of those individual points on that map are donut shops that were suggested to us by people all over Chicago. So these are all of their favorite donut shops because we asked them to submit them to us. And that part of this scheme that I'm explaining right now, that part was really successful. But if you notice, the different colors and the loops and these routes that we created, we had this idea that we would make 4 different donut crawls for people who wanted to be a part of this story.
Or wanted to become diabetic.
Or become diabetic. But, and this is really interesting to note here, we had this idea that we were going to be able to get people out on the weekends, out with their kids in their cars, driving like halfway around the city, eating donuts for us. And we even made this donut tasting guide. It's a hand-drawn guide in which we interviewed this local donut celebrity, thinking that people doing this donut crawl would print this out and take it with them, and we'd be able to totally decide which is the best donut shop in Chicago. This is the point here. Be careful if you're gonna try to work with the public. Be careful how much you ask of them, and also be really clear about what you are asking them, because hardly anybody showed up for this donut crawl, right? So we did have one family come, and it was great, and we were so excited that they would meet us, but we put all this effort into this thing, and nobody really showed up for it. But that being said, we still have this problem. Who's going to decide what's the best donut shop? So we, I'll show you who we asked. This is David Haynes. He is a former Chicago police lieutenant. There's actually some audio.
Oh yeah, there might
here.
be some audio on there. I don't know if it's able to bring that one up. Here, let's go back and forth. See if we can go back.
All right, hit it.
I've always been a fan of the apple cinnamon. We're going to try a bacon maple donut in a few minutes, so that might be my new favorite.
There you go.
A cop.
A cop.
One cop. That's engagement for you right there.
Yeah.
So we couldn't even really, because of our ask and the high investment that was required from the people who might be participating in this. We couldn't even get these people to come out for donuts, so that's an important note there. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So just moving on to talk a little bit about multimedia and the ways that we approach multimedia at Curious City. It's really baked in right from the beginning. So we really consider ourselves a multimedia team. So we start thinking about different ways to tell stories basically from the first meeting in which we go over the production plan and start talking about what a satisfying answer would look like. So, we like to go by this principle that we report stories in the way that they're best told. So that could mean breaking out a certain part and making it an interactive, or producing a video for a certain part, and all with the goal of adding value to the story as a whole. So, so we do this in a lot of ways. Sometimes it's kind of like lo-fi stuff, or we use online services. We've experimented with things like on Scribd or ThingLink, but there are some things that we make from scratch, and that is to better accommodate who's going to be participating in this visualization or in this like multimedia endeavor. So this question is a good example. It comes from Sarah Lynn Pablo, and she asked, where does our unmistakable and lovable Chicago accent come from? So in order to help answer that question, what you're looking at right now is an interactive kind of infographic collection, multimedia experience in which we opened our hotline and had people from all over the city, or we invited people from all over the city to read this passage. It's over on the left, and I'll flip to it in a second. That was developed for us by a linguist that would showcase your Chicago accent according to different traits of like Chicago-ness. So what you're seeing here now, we got over like a couple hundred responses, and you can sort by how many traits you matched in this linguist's guide. So you can actually play all of them. The right column, changes based on the data that we collected from the people whose voices you'll hear. And this is an example of what the passage was. It's called "Too Hot for Hockey." So as you can imagine, it was pretty fun to listen to, and I'm just going to play like the best clip. This guy, I'll tell you who it is after this, but he got 5 out of 5 traits, and there are only a couple of them. So here, we can listen to this, and make sure the audio's on.
Yes,
Too hot for hockey. Don and Patty took the bus to the gym to watch some hockey. They met their pals, Dawn and Chad. They snacked on nachos, hot dogs, sausage, and pop. Then they noticed something odd. The gym was getting hot. Don and Dawn took off their jackets. Patty wiped the sweat with a paper towel. Chad took off his hat and used it as a fan. The puck never hit the ice, which sadly has begun to melt. They couldn't get the gym cool enough. The match was canceled, so the friends headed to the bar to watch the Sox game.
So just, kind of as a fun aside there, that guy who you just heard, he's actually the UPS guy. His name is Tom Pikorsky, and he's the UPS guy at WBEZ. We see him all the time still, and it's great running into him.
Hey, Tom.
Tom.
So Logan was going over a little bit of like some of the lessons learned from our kind of editorial process of being committed to engage the public. And the lesson there is that sometimes you just got to build it yourself. We happen to have used the SoundCloud API, some very simple JavaScript tools and all that to make all that happen. But we needed a little bit of developer time and some graphic design time as well as help from the public. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, we have access to a radio station. We're a public radio station, WBEZ in Chicago, and sometimes we'll just mix it up with really low tech stuff. And editorially, the principle's the same, but it really wasn't all that complicated. I'm going to give you the example here. We have the question is, how did Chicago grow over time? And we did a short story about how we used an infographic, for example, to answer exactly how Chicago grew by annexing its neighbors, and we started with a little bit of a teaser story there. We just gave the basic answer visually speaking, right? And this is an animated GIF. You can't see it in Prezi, but it's an animated GIF. It grows over time, and you can tell exactly where it's going. But here's the thing, as journalists and editors and producers, we like to tell narrative stories as well. But we wanted to keep the basic information apart from the narrative. So we thought, well, hey, we're going to engage the public. Why not have the public decide exactly which anecdotal narrative to do, right? So what we did was we went to suburbs of Chicago that had actively resisted annexation by the city. And we asked the mayors there to actually make a case to our Curious City audience about which of those stories we should tell in more depth.
We wanted to tell the story of a stubborn suburb, but we couldn't decide which story to tell. So we're asking you, which of Chicago's stubborn suburbs do you want to hear more about? To help you decide, we stirred up some suburban rivalries. Whose history of independence is the most interesting? We asked head honchos of 3 communities to make the case. The contenders are Blue Island, Oak Park, Evanston.
My name is Domingo F. Vargas. I'm the mayor of the city of Blue Island. I think WBEZ's Curious City should tell our story about resisting annexation. We have more history than Chicago, and we're more independent. We have a lot to offer. We can make it on our own. We're the center of the universe. We consider Chicago to be our suburb.
Hi, I'm Anan Abu Talib, the village president of Oak Park. Curious City should investigate why we decided to be independent. Oak Parkers look at themselves and say, hey.
Okay, so we had Evanston, Oak Park, and Blue Island make their case directly to the audience. And I got to say, this was a very successful engagement. This was very low tech. We went on air and said, hey, come to the website. We've put up a really quick Google form, which, by the way, Blue Island themselves were advocates for the story. They embedded the Google form on their own website and tweeted it like crazy, and it was our highest level of engagement outside of the Accents database that we had done. It was very successful. And by the way, Blue Island won, and some city officials and the Chamber of Commerce, I think, put on a party to listen to the story when it was concluded, which was really fun considering it was during a blizzard, right?
Oh yeah, it was epically cold that day.
It was very cold. So again, the lesson there is that sometimes this stuff can be very, very low tech, but we left ourselves open as well, just whatever the engagement and the editorial strategy had actually required. So again, we've been doing, Curious City's been doing these experiments of engagement at various levels for a couple years, and I wanted to take a few moments, and Jennifer's going to end here, with some meta lessons outside of the things that we already brought up. The first is that our audience, when we first started putting up our questions database, we really didn't know what to expect. There was a little bit of sweat coming down the brow of our managing editors, like, oh, I don't know. And Jennifer did not mention this, but the very first question that we answered on air, I think, was where does the poop from the Lincoln Park Zoo go? And man, I really got some flack for allowing that one. Yeah.
It was fascinating for the record.
It was fascinating, by the way.
Started a beautiful relationship.
Just Google hippo party and you'll understand. But anyway, yeah, there was a lot of trepidation about this. We just didn't know. And one of the things that we learned right away is, wow, eclectic tastes. This is a public radio station. We've been on the air for a long time. We have entire departments devoted to, say, politics and all that. And man, we were getting asked questions about zoo poop and, really interesting stuff like why it is that, this top one, for example, what's the average income of a street performer? We've had an arts and culture desk for a long time. No one's done that story, right? Okay, so the big lesson here is if you're going to take on a model like this, you want to prepare yourself for something positive, maybe, that that the questions you're asked don't necessarily reflect your beat structure or whatever internal structure you have. And remember, our question to the public is, what question about Chicago, the region, and its people, would you like WBEZ to investigate? We purposely left it really open like that. But we thought, we're just going to get a whole bunch of questions that are targeted for the political reporter, almost as in, could you have Alex Keefe, ask the mayor this kind of question? But we didn't get those things, and that was very surprising, and we were glad to have that. And something you should prepare yourself for. Another thing that we learned is we were expecting lots of news-based questions. That Chicago's a news town, right? Breaking news, and our own station actually is engaged in breaking news. And we hardly ever, out of 3,000, almost 3,000 questions at this point, maybe, 2,800, something like that, we hardly ever get asked breaking news questions. As in some of the examples we've given, some of them are very basic. What are those red X signs? Another one is, why doesn't the city let trucks on Lakeshore Drive, for example? Very basic information that can lead to deep stories. And the content that we started providing in response to that is kind of evergreen, actually. It can really last a long time. We didn't see that coming. Another point is that we have really valued various levels of engagement. We've seen actual editorial value in each and every level, from back to those red dots I was showing you earlier, from the pitch process to allowing people to co-report with us sometimes, to allowing them to at least respond to our declaration that we're working on something specific. All of this has been really valuable, and we've learned that people are willing to help and can really make a big contribution at every level. And the other thing is, relative to our other digital content at WBEZ, our audience likes this material. It's among the most popular series the station's ever done, on the digital side in particular. Our podcast does very well relative to other locally produced podcasts, and we have very high brand recognition of our on-air content as well. So it's been good all around.
Yeah, but I like to say one of our favorite metrics are that I don't know that anyone has built this into their chart beat, but is how many handwritten thank you cards have you gotten for your series? We have a drawer full right now at our station, and that's something that we feel that when you actually directly serve the public, when they come along with you, when you have a relationship, when you remember someone on this first name basis, there's something special that happens. And they don't just think of your brand in the same way, and this isn't why we do it. It's not for, brand awareness, but
I do, Jen.
You have to for your job. But there is something special that happens when you bring people together in this way that they're not used to being in. They feel gratitude for it, they want to express it, and they want to be a part of the station. And that's something we didn't know starting off. We didn't know if anyone would give a crap about, telling us what we should report. And our audience is smart. They have a lot of opinions. Why don't we listen to them more? This is just one form of us listening to them, this project. One of the other things that I like to say, and I feel that works for us, is that we engage because we actually care what they think. There are so many reasons why people want to engage today. It's for metrics, it's because your boss is telling you to, it's a buzzword, it's something we're all talking about because we're scared that we're going to lose audience in all the different platforms. But if you engage because you actually care and value what the person you're engaging with thinks, I think amazing things happen. And this woman right here, Janice Thompson, is one example. She asked us a question about how much natural gas in Chicago is produced through fracking. It was a really tough investigation. It was hard to get good numbers. We ended up doing a couple different stories on them, and talking about how hard it is to get the numbers, which we thought was of value as well. But at every point in the process, we asked Janice, what do you think? Is this going to change the way that you approach your energy? Is this going to change who your provider is? Is this changing the way that you think about things? And we listened to her, and that made a huge difference to her. We didn't know that it would. We just wanted to know, is this information helpful to you? Are we serving your need that you asked us to? And it turns out that Janice ended up changing careers. She is now working doing the C3 Electric Community, this interactive community-based activities to engage Chicagoans around the greening of energy. And she wrote up this beautiful blog post. This is just an expert. And she said that knowing that the staff at WBEZ's Curious City cared what I did, that they valued citizen input as much as that of experts, kept me going. And this was like an 8-month odyssey of us trying to figure this stuff out and going back and forth with her. And this is the kind of power that I think that a process like this really has. And if you're engaging because you actually care about what people think, not because you're doing it for metrics, I think amazing things can happen. And the last lesson that we've learned is that this process and the way that we've been trying it for the last few years is hard, but it's really fun. I'd venture to guess it's more fulfilling, and from the feedback that we get from the reporters that we work with in the newsroom, and we've worked with more than 50 different people, from interns to hosts to producers to freelancers, they all say that there's a different kind of energy around approaching a story for a single person who you can reach out and touch than for a nameless, faceless audience that you feel like you might know what they want, but at the end of the day, you're on to the next story before you're even, thinking about how it impacted the community. So we've had a great time. We are, I think, the desk that laughs the most at our station and has the most fun in our jobs, which has been great.
We're laughing over those handwritten thank you cards.
Exactly, yeah. So just to give you a little bit of context, like backing up as to how Curious City even got to be, because you might be wondering, maybe I want to try something like this in my newsroom, maybe not. But Curious City was actually kind of implanted in a sneaky, excellent way through the Association of Independents in Radio. They're called AIR. If you're interested in radio, highly suggest you join. But basically, in 2012, they put out a call for producers to be embedded in local public media stations to try to shake things up and to give them a year and some space to try out new ideas and create assets for the station that may or may not be able to translate and work for other places. So we are just really one of 10 projects around the country that had a year to try and shake things up. So I highly recommend you going online to localor.net, checking out the other 9 projects. It's a great site, and there's tremendous work that folks have been doing, kind of our sister or cohorts in this process. And what's next for us is that we did find that this process that we're doing is replicable. We have 7 other stations right now trying out what we're doing and having great success, surprisingly, shockingly great success. And we're looking to actually build this model out from a curious city to a curious nation. So if this is something that you're interested in, we're not saying this is only for public media. We're really curious, of course, about how this could work in other contexts. So just anyway, reach out to me. I'm on Twitter. You can find me at jbrandell@wbez.org. If even parts of this are things you want to talk about, we're trying to build a community of best practice around this because we think that there is something to it. And with that, we have a lot of time for questions. I think there might be a mic in the middle, so have at it.
Hi, thanks for sharing. This is great. My name is Scott Walker, Alabama Alabama Media Group, and we're a for-profit media, and we're using some of these ideas and plan to borrow more. So thank you for this. I hope it's seen as flattery.
Oh, fantastic.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that's fantastic.
I was curious about how much moderation and reframing of the questions you do before You do turn them over for voting, is that correct? Yeah. And how do you associate related questions and build on questions that might be part of a bigger question?
Thanks, Scott. The first answer to your first question about like what do we do with the questions, frankly, we edit them as people submit them in the form that they can do online, and also when we approach them on the street, or even when we have them handwrite them and then we enter them in a database later on. We let them know that we may actually edit them. It's a very good thing we did that, because originally we did not have a character or a word limit. And so people either went on screeds or they actually built, 5 questions instead of 1, that kind of deal. So we actually edit them, and we let them know that we edit them, especially when we're putting them out in front of the rest of the public for the public to decide, say, in that assignment process that I talked about. The voting rounds in particular are our current means of doing that. We may come up with others, but we definitely edit them for space, clarity. Sometimes they're offensive, frankly. And it may not even be appropriate for us to put that in front of the public. We also get, occasionally we get a question or two about ourselves. We typically don't answer questions about the station or ourselves. We just take those out and we write them an email. To follow up on the rest of your question, the technology right now is we've created some custom software that helps us collect and curate the questions. We're kind of in the 2.0 process of that, stage of that right now. It could be improved. Right now, sometimes it's a little difficult for the public to actually detect whether a question has already been asked or even frankly answered. So that's definitely something on our punch list, so to speak, to fix if we were to revisit the technology.
Yeah, and just to add to that real quick, something we did really recently is that we noticed in our archive, and this has been happening since we basically started the project, is that we'll get a lot of questions that are really the same thing, and especially if something just aired or if we put out a story, it's pretty funny. We'll actually get that exact question again, like right after we answered it. But just in the last week, we all kind of came up with this idea to make like a digital stationery and a letter, kind of like a letterhead, and that was to be sent out to anybody who is asked a question that we've actually already answered. And this was a way to kind of mine our archive and repurpose that old material and send it directly, back to that one person and post it around on social media too. So it's kind of like a public letter re-answering a question.
Yeah, it's kind of a cheeky letter of like, hey, we've already answered this. You must have missed that, right? And then we send that on to social media as well as kind of a means of letting the rest of the audience understand that this has been addressed. But also to pick up on this as well, it's an indication. Sometimes if we get overlap, to me as an editor, that's an indication that there may actually be more interest in that question. The Red X question was along those lines. We got something like, I can't remember the exact figure.
Like 6 or 7, I think.
Yeah, it was like 6 or 7, something like that. And they were all very similarly worded, and they were over a very long period of time. And so I was like, well, there must be something to this. And I had talked to a producer on one of our talk shows, and she's like, oh, I'm from this community. People think that it means these buildings are going to be demolished right away. And I'm like, wow, that's a dangerous assumption for the community to make, because they're actually dangerous buildings, and there is no other support for these buildings at all. It doesn't mean anything. They're just dangerous, and they're going to sit there, and they're going to be dangerous. And so that was an alert to us. It's like that actually might be, one, really important to do because we don't see any other coverage, and 2, it may actually be potentially popular. I mean, it's a small user base, but it helps make those decisions for us.
Yeah, next question.
Hey there, my name's Mathilde Piard. I actually just recently joined the public radio world when I started NPR 2 months ago. I have a question, but first I also have a statement. Please come to DC. This is so incredibly awesome, and
We're talking to WAMU, so.
I know I sound like a fangirl, but this is awesome. So my question is, I think you mentioned you've received 3,000 questions so far total. Over what period of time is that? How many of those have you answered? And how do you handle the ones you don't answer to close the loop and to kind of be like, so that people aren't just asking questions into like an empty room?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've gotten close to 3,000 questions over the course of about 2 years. And what we do is we show them transparently. So if you go to curiouscity.org/question archive or archive, you're able to see all of the questions that people asked. What's great too is that that's a spot where community members, in particular, we have a couple people who are like Rain Men of Chicago knowledge, who just know everything. So they'll a lot of times answer questions right there in the comment section. But we keep those live. Those are always live. Unless we've answered a question, it stays in that archive. So that's something that we revisit all the time. You know, we had a voting round a few weeks ago. I think we had in question number 30 on our list that, you know, made it back to the top. We pay attention to patterns, and we have questions basically be alive. We don't know if we'll ever be able to answer every question, and that's kind of a nice thing. I think we have kind of an infinitely curious audience and an infinitely curious city to mine. So hopefully that bodes well for us being around for a little while. But the other thing is that the archive, the way it works, that when you ask a question, you get a little notification that says, "Thanks for asking. Your question's going to live here. We'll be in touch if we're able to answer it." You know, we could approach this in a very different way, where we're just answering very specific things and just sending it to, you know, emails to people, or, you know, having 1-minute news spots that say these things. But we're really interested right now, our format, in doing kind of longer form investigative pieces that are narrative and more highly produced. So there might be opportunities to use a lot of the questions in different ways. But you know, there is a chance if you ask a question, we'll never get around to answering it. It's really the three of us plus whoever we can rope in at any given time. So we are limited by just our bandwidth.
I think the other thing is that the station, WBEZ, you know, has a very large, it's a membership-driven institution, and it has a lot of volunteers as well. So people in our orbit are very familiar with the idea that they're volunteering something to us and, you know, and working with us, often with content. I would say that if we were to revisit some of the language, we would try to make it probably a little bit clearer that what you're doing is you're pitching. I mean, that's basically what you're doing. You're pitching through a question, but we want it to live and continue to live because it may be of some value, say, to either one, other news organizations, and yes, other news organizations, at least in one instance, have actually have answered a question that's like live that we haven't gotten to yet, which is fine. Or, again, someone might say, oh, I like that question, but this is a better version of it. Yeah. Or if you get to this question, maybe you can answer mine too. And so there's a community kind of involvement of just having the questions out there, and there's at least some value in there. And as Jennifer had mentioned, there are people who will try to actually answer some of these on their own as well, and there's a lot of value to that. So I think if we were to do it a little bit differently next time, or maybe in the future, we would maybe tweak that language a little bit. Because every once in a while, you will run across a person like, oh, rats, you know, you haven't answered it yet, or something like that. I think if it were just a little bit clearer, there'd be a little bit more satisfaction there.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, good.
Hi guys, Madeline Bear. I'm with Witness, and in a prior lifetime worked at BZ with Sean and the rest of the awesome team there. So it's really inspiring and exciting to see what you guys are doing. And definitely has me thinking of how this sort of model could be adapted in human rights documentation, which is the field that I work in now. But my question for you is, I'm wondering how much this has bled into the rest of the newsroom in terms of, you know, are reporters now reporting on other stories or changing kind of their focuses or priorities now that they can see more clearly what the audience is interested in? And do they report differently because of this experience?
That's a great question. I'll start. I'm sure everyone has thoughts to say about this. I think what we tried to do very consciously when we first started was to not be a little fiefdom, another silo in a siloed newsroom, and really work a lot with people, so threading people through our system. I think we've worked with pretty much every reporter that we have at the station. Except for one. Yeah, who's had like a very intense beat and projects that are year-long and whatnot. And because they get to work with us, and because we're a highly collaborative team, so someone might go out with Logan to shoot a video, they're gonna learn new skills as they're working with us. They might not really tweet that much, or they might have never used Tumblr or never thought about doing a data, you know, visualization because they came through radio reporting. So I feel like regardless if they're changing their process to be just like us, they are picking up new skills in the kind of sandbox that we play in just through coming through our system. Whether or not our culture at the station is changing, I would say in some ways, yes. Our team right now is being modeled for a potential kind of restructuring of the organization because of the way that we work, that we're multidisciplinary, and have a team approach to storytelling instead of everyone going off on their own. So that's one of the ways that I feel like we've influenced the station.
And there are smaller or smaller scope ways too. Like, for example, we'll have some reporters in the newsroom, let's say there's an election coming up, who will want to get more public insight and questions on a particular topic. So we actually, on our back end, we can customize different categories and ask people, basically make a new ask to the public to gather questions based on this particular topic. So one example was the Illinois race for governor. Yeah, so our political reporters came to us and said, hey, we want to learn more about this. How can we work together? And we actually got a good amount of questions just from a really particular targeted ask that, people in our newsroom approached us about first.
I would say from the very, very, broad picture, we can look to some very specific examples of change. I would say that it's more beyond kind of the individuals that we worked with, or maybe the individual editors. I would say that we've been a very good example of like a different kind of workflow. Also, again, multimedia focus in a shop that does mostly radio. And so I think a lot of the collaborations and the goodwill that we've had so far actually has a lot to do with the fact that we actually work in the web team, but yet we're on air all the time. And so we straddle those quite a bit. I was traditionally, at WBEZ, I was traditionally a broadcast editor and producer, reporter, and we had just, it's a structural thing. But I would say beyond that, though, it is actually a tough road, because you can do really good work, and then people will say, oh, I love that story, I love that process, but they're not necessarily replicating it on their own. They could, or they could incorporate some of the things on their own. It's just like, oh, well, that's the Curious City process. So you do kind of run a little bit of a danger, I think, sometimes of over-branding a process itself, even internally. And so what we're trying to do at this point, especially our supervisor, is really trying to get other editors to kind of think through some of the engagement principles and use those in everyday kind of ways, if not directly by the kind of question-based sort of thing that we do ourselves. So there's a lot of work left to be done, but we've had good traction so far.
Great, and I think we have just about 4 minutes left, so hopefully we can get both these questions in, and we'll stick around too for anyone who wants to talk.
Sure.
I'm Katie Herzog from WFAE Public Radio in Charlotte, and I'm curious about how you see the viability of this for small organizations, like an organization that doesn't have multimedia producers, doesn't have developers, and maybe doesn't even have really the resources to do a separate vertical, and if this is something that can be just incorporated without all of the extra stuff.
Yeah, that's a great question. We're excited to say we have a partner who we look to say, oh yeah, it can work at a station with 2 employees. So we partnered with WYSO in Ohio, and their series is called Why So Curious, which is adorable, and we're glad they called it that. But they have just a couple of reporters on staff, very small. They're a community station. They serve kind of the Dayton area. And what they do a monthly story. And they do 1 feature a month, and it kind of fits into their morning edition and All Things Considered clock. So it's something that's 4 to 6 minutes around there. And that's what they do. We produce a lot. We produce about 36 minutes of content a week that's highly produced. So I think it can work. You could use it for holiday specials or fillers in between things, or even, not to get too wonky with this crowd, but there's a new clock coming out for public radio, and there's like 2-minute holes that would be perfect to answer small questions in. But there is a way to make it flexible. We have a few different newsrooms that have it set up in a few different ways. Some, where the digital side of the newsroom is taking this on. Others where it's the broadcast. Others where it's both. So I do think it's a model that is inherently flexible and that you could use for whatever your needs. I will say that, though, having done these stories over time, the more you're on air and the more you're branded, kind of the more engagement and the more questions you'll get. But all you need is 1 question a month if you do a monthly series that's good to make a great story. So it's really not a lot.
Yeah, and I just want to talk really quickly to your point about multimedia. It doesn't always, applying multimedia doesn't always have to be like a big video production. It's kind of, or what I've been learning since, producing stuff for Curious City is that it has to do with how you approach it. So I just want to quickly talk about this illustrated guide that we made for, not the donut guide, for proper trash disposal in Chicago. We basically made a guide that this one woman who's in charge of trash disposal in this one part of the city, her best practices, and we named the guide after her, and we had her quoted throughout this guide. So it's kind of engaging your sources as being part of that product too, and I think that could happen at any level of organization, no matter how big or small you are.
And Jennifer had mentioned WYSO. Another thing that's notable here is that we are general assignment in some ways. We're kind of committed to being available and open to pretty much any question about Chicago, the region, and its people. That's not necessarily the case at WYSO. The reporter there is pretty much focused on economics and business reporting, as I understand it, and also like neighborhood development kind of issues, and that's his beat. And so they kind of narrowed the kind of scope of what they're willing to take on from the public in that way, and they make it really clear to the audience. And so I would say that, like, if you make it really clear to the audience what relationship you're going to have in terms of like what products you can actually produce, so maybe you can only do radio, only do TV, only do web articles, that's okay, as long as the audience understands it, and as long as you have a means of getting questions. And in WYSO's case, they use a Google form. That's it. And it's a Google spreadsheet and a form, and that's enough to power them. They have 3/4 of a producer's time, one story a month, a single beat, and a Google form. But the process has been very similar. So.
Okay, great. And I think this will be the last question.
Hi, my name is Clinton King. I'm a student at the university.
Oh, sorry. Can't quite hear you. Can you start over?
Oops, sorry. My name's Clinton King. I'm a student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I think what you guys are doing is really interesting. I like how you put citizens in front of, like, as a major part of the story. I was curious, so when you're dealing with these, like, question askers and you're making them a major part of the story, I'm sure you've run into instances where some of them have, like, a bias of some sort towards the question they're asking. How do you deal with that? Do you try and, like, avoid that, or do you embrace it and make it part of the story?
Sean, you want to take that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because we suspected that might be the case, and that one, you would get either, say, an activist with either an agenda or a business trying to be promotional, etc. There are a lot of different ways of looking at that, and we've approached it several different ways. And I guess the way that I look at it at this point now is, if it's really clear to the audience why that person is asking the question, I think that's the most valuable and useful thing. I can give you a concrete example. There was a woman who was about to marry her same-sex partner in Illinois, and her question was about whether the next governor in Illinois could overturn the policy on same-sex marriage in Illinois, which it's allowed, by the way. It's a recent change. And we're having an election, so the question is, will that persist? Because could it just change with the next governor? And it was very clear. I mean, obviously this person has an interest in that policy, staying as is for now. And the question was, well, why are we giving this person any airtime? Well, okay, well, why did we ever go to get man or woman interviews on the street in the first place then? Why are we looking for any opinion at all? And if you have to understand what a rationale is for the news value, you know what? I already agree with the news value on here. We are the backstop of of something being fair. But just because someone has some motivation doesn't mean it's unimportant to everyone else. That question is equally valid and interesting to people on both sides of that issue, and I'm not going to stop a perfectly good story because someone actually might be really interested in the answer, or might be really motivated to have an answer. We do turn down things where it's very obvious. We don't say, like, why does Rahm Emanuel suck so bad? We don't do those. Okay, or if there's some name, yeah, we get that once in a while, more often than you would think. Yeah, so why not let that story go through? Is their participation wrong in some way? I don't think so. And she asked some of the questions directly to experts political analysts and all that, and they didn't bat an eye at it. And we were very transparent about where she was coming from. So I felt pretty good about that. I think we've treaded the line at some times. What we run into more problems is where the audience may have a different understanding of a term than we do. So for example, in the governor's race question, someone asked about gun violence, and what she meant was gun violence and any harm by guns. Not just gun violence, where people are intentionally trying to hurt one another, but like accidents and all that kind of thing as well. And we didn't learn about that discrepancy until the story was almost done. And so you really have to kind of like engage these people as a single person. You really need to we do interviews with our question askers to understand where they're coming from, what they mean, that kind of thing. And I think that's the big lesson, that like if you're really working with individuals in this particular way, beyond kind of traditional crowdsourcing sort of thing, these are some of the minds that you'll encounter. And I think they've run into some of this issue in WISO as well, where they kind of felt that like, oh, this person's agenda is a little bit too much. They have a conversation with them, and they either kill the story or not. But if you have to wonder, how's that any different than if you had just received a tip on your news hotline or an email? You still have to do pretty much the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with that being said, we do feel like a community of best practice is growing right now, just with the stations who are doing the same thing that we're doing. And if you're interested in being part of that community of best practice, having these discussions, these ethical, sticky, very interesting discussions, we would love to have them with you. So thank you so much. We know this is the last session. We really appreciate you coming and your attention.
¡Vámonos!